He knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
This is a story of how some yellowish-greenish rock changed the world forever, giving humanity the key to its own destruction, a product of civilization's genius, as well as a pathway to its potential demise. A humble stone that, when combined with the brilliance of a reluctant modern set of scientists, would in the eyes of many bring us back to the Stone Age. The origins of this rock trace back over 6 billion years ago, forged in the supernovas. But the human history of this brownish lime-green rock is far more recent, dating back to the 19th century, under the study of Marie Curie. She was studying radioactivity at the time, and by the next century, many speculated about the power of the atom being used for military purposes. Much of this research done was by Jewish scientists in Germany. By the time World War II broke out, scientists of both the Allies and the Axis powers were excited yet concerned about the power of nuclear fission. The race truly began when a German guy you may have heard of called Albert Einstein sent a letter to another guy you may have heard of called President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, warning him of another guy you may have heard of by the name of Adolf Hitler's potential plans. To what extent the German plan to produce this kernel of mayhem is still up for debate, but it was far too risky for the liberal democracies of the West to have fascism hold a monopoly on the power of this rock. By the time the US was not fighting the war, but it did set up the Uranium Committee, alongside British and Canadian scientists who had been undergoing their own weapons projects. Eventually, the three Anglophone democracies would team up under the Manhattan Project. This was led by a man called J. Robert Oppenheimer. The other major country fighting the Germans, the Soviet Union, was left out. Despite its name, the Manhattan Project, the bulk of the research was done in Los Alamos, New Mexico. New Mexico barely had been a state at this point, and the focus was shifting towards East Asia. Both German and Japanese plans to develop their own nuclear weapons eventually fell flat. When FDR died, President Truman came into office. The Americans had already tested the bomb in New Mexico, codenamed Trinity, a biblical reference. During the Potsdam Conference, Churchill informed Stalin of the bomb. The Allies also sent Japan an ultimatum: surrender or undergo, quote, complete and utter destruction, end quote. The US was faced with a dilemma: either invade Japan, causing the deaths of a ghastly number of Americans and Japanese alike, or use the atomic bomb, also killing hundreds of thousands. Both options were awful, but one had to be picked to bring the last outbursts of fascism to its knees. President Truman picked the bomb. Two, in fact. One bomb, the little boy, hit Hiroshima, and another one called the Fat Man hit Nagasaki. Kyoto, the imperial city, was spared due to its historical significance. And with that, the Japanese Empire surrendered. A murderous empire ended at the cost of so many innocent lives. Whether you think this was justified is still up for debate, but regardless of that, the orange mushroom cloud hovering over those two cities changed the world forever. Those uranium rocks, mined from the Belgian Congo and refined in Ontario, Canada, and then dropped on Japan, created a paradigm that could, in turn, upend the entire global system. Einstein was against dropping the bomb, but the person most concerned with the bomb was the daddy of the bomb itself, Robert Oppenheimer. A man of science, sought wisdom from religious texts, namely the Hindu Bhagavad Gita, a 700-verse script covering the cosmological battle. Oppenheimer compared himself to the Hindu god of destruction, Shiva. Many speculated at the time, and ever since, that the use of the bomb was a way to ward off the Soviet Union, would emerge as the core enemy of Western liberal capitalist democracy as the Axis powers were brought to their knees. The use of the bomb had led to the setup of the Atomic Energy Commission right after the war to oversee the development of nuclear weapons. I had mentioned the Soviet Union before, and it turned out that they had done a great deal of spying on their quasi-allies, now enemies, and they had tested their own fission bomb in 1949 to the shock of the capitalist world. The US monopoly was no longer. The weapons got more deadly than those dropped on Japan, making the atomic bomb look like a butter knife. The world was aghast at the hydrogen bomb, which was lighter, smaller, yet far more deadly. Both the Americans and the Soviets tested even more deadly bombs several times. The most famous American testing during this time period was in the Bikini Atoll in the Marshall Islands, using a thermonuclear bomb using isotopes of lithium as fission fuel. The prelude of this event led to the forced removal of over 200 natives, along with mass ecological destruction of a once vibrant coral reef system. In 1961, the Soviets outdid the US with the Tsar bomb, another thermonuclear weapon dropped in the Arctic tundra, the largest ever dropped. The Soviets would eventually produce more weapons than the Americans, even though their tech oftentimes lagged behind, so they focused on quantity. The US and Canada would set up NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, as an aerospace warning system, as Soviet nukes would likely cross over the Arctic given the curvature of the Earth. The US and USSR eventually developed more concrete methods of potentially using these nukes. Tactical weapons were produced for small-scale military use on the battlefield in case of a quasi-conventional war, and strategic weapons could be used to destroy the opposing country completely. However, some have argued that even the use of tactical nukes would be strategic, since it would escalate the war into using strategic nukes. This leads us to the concept of mutually assured destruction, or MAD. Since the two powers had nukes, engaging in a nuclear exchange would result in both nations being destroyed. If one launches nukes first, then the other would launch the nukes in a second strike, destroying both of them. This is a lose-lose scenario, which makes nuclear war, ironically enough, less likely. In fact, it made war as a whole less likely. For had it not been for these weapons, the Cold War probably would have turned hot. As strange as it sounds, the worst weapons of war have ever built set the stage for lasting peace. This is not to say that it did not come close. In 1962, the Soviets had placed some of their weapons in Cuba, provoking the Cuban Missile Crisis. These were 13 days of some of the most intense diplomacy between President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev, ending with the removal of Soviet nukes from Cuba and American nukes from Turkey. One Soviet naval officer prevented a Soviet nuclear torpedo from being launched, despite the other two officers agreeing to it, which is why he is sometimes considered to be the man who saved the world. Had Stalin been the leader rather than Khrushchev, or Nixon rather than Kennedy, then perhaps we would not be here to listen to this video. The Cuban Missile Crisis led to more safety procedures and a direct hotline between the two camps, along with ever-growing anti-nuclear sentiment. Kennedy and Khrushchev eventually signed the Partial Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited nuclear weapons tests that were conducted underground. After Carl Sagan and other scientists had studied the potential effects of nuclear fallout, as well as nuclear winter which would result in it, the US and the Soviet Union teamed together to clamp down on nuclear weapon production through the use of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty, which banned the ground-based short intermediate range nukes. Further studies done by Carl Sagan and others found that the results of nuclear winter, while horrifying, were not quite necessarily an extinction event. By the late 80s, the Soviet Union was decaying, and by 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. East and West Germany were uniting. The center point of the Cold War came as one. The Warsaw Pact collapsed. Many Eastern European nations transitioned into capitalist democracies and eventually joined the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In December of 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed, and while it still held nukes, the likelihood of nuclear war was far, far lower. Eventually, Soviet nukes located in Ukraine and Kazakhstan were given back to Russia under the condition that Russia would respect their sovereignty. In hindsight, given the war in Ukraine, this did not end up being the case. During the early 2010s, under the Obama and Medvedev administrations, the two countries set up the New START, which sought to cut the number of nuclear launchers by 50% and allow for cross-inspections. It had a promising start at first, but later versions of that expired and didn't really go anywhere. And by the time Russia invaded Ukraine, Putin suspended the program. Keep in mind that this wasn't just between the US and the Soviet Union. Many Western European nations were also under the NATO alliance during the Cold War led by the US and still are today. And Eastern European countries during the Cold War were led by the Soviet Union under the Warsaw Pact. The US and USSR and later Russia would not be the only countries to have nukes. The UK, one of the co-inventors of the first nuclear weapon, was barred from receiving more nuclear technology. This was under the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, which placed nuclear weapons under civilian hands rather than the military in the United States. To this day, nukes are run by the Department of Energy rather than the Defense Department under the Pentagon. The US developed a triad, meaning that there were three methods of using nukes: one by land, using launch pads, one by sea, using submarines, and the other by air, by aircraft. Now, the aforementioned UK, seeing its power projections backslide as its empire was crumbling, sought to develop its own nuclear weapons. Another nation that sought out nuclear weapons was France. A nation with, at this point, diminishing prestige, seeing its empire collapse in a far more violent, messy, and embarrassing manner than those of the British. The French had already invested a great deal in nuclear power for civilian purposes, in which plutonium was a byproduct. French President Charles de Gaulle saw nuclear weapons as a sign of France being a first-rate power rather than a second-rate power. He was not only an anti-communist, but also had some reservations towards the Anglosphere, seeing them as allies of convenience rather than true friends. To this day, France's nuclear weapons program is not fully integrated with NATO. However, it remains the only nuclear-armed power within the European Union ever since the UK left. And then we have to go to China. China was supplying the Soviet Union with uranium core. As the Western powers did their best to cut off Russians from African mineral supplies, the Soviets refused to hand the Chinese any bombs or directly help them in producing their own. But their research programs did indirectly help them, and in 1964, there were 5 nations that had them. Today, those 5 nations, the US, France, UK, the Soviet Union, now Russia, as well as the People's Republic of China, are the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. China, to this day, does not allow for the first use of nuclear capability under its military doctrine. However, this is rather opaque, and whether or not this would play out in an actual event of war is uncertain. Much of the concern over the spread of nukes led to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which sought to restrict the use of these weapons, or even the production of these weapons, as well as their technology. After all, the more nations patrol nukes around, the more dangerous it becomes. It was in Geneva, Switzerland, that nearly every state signed on to the treaty except for India and Pakistan, which are some of the 2 most powerful nuclear-armed states today, which are not members of the UN Security Council permanently. But signing on to a treaty doesn't mean that you follow it. North Korea signed on to the treaty, but we'll find out how that went later. The Chinese also sent some of their technology to Pakistan, an ally and mutual rival of India. India had produced its own nuclear weapons during the 1970s. Pakistan would lag behind, getting them in 1998, far later due to their own political stability and lower levels of technological output. The two countries have been rivals ever since independence. When it comes to conventional military means, India is far more powerful, hence why they have a non-first use policy like China. However, Pakistan does allow for a first strike. This is primarily because India beats it when it comes to conventional military power. Keep in mind that India and China fought a brief war in 1962. The Indians named their first bomb the Smiling Buddha to warn China and Pakistan. I'm sure the enlightened one would have been pleased to have hell in a shell named after his happy face. Like Pakistan, Russia also rejects the no first use policy, saying that they have the right to use nuclear weapons in response to large-scale conventional aggression. For example, during the war in Ukraine, Putin has been quite loose with threatening the use of tactical nukes. The United States, UK, and France have been far less likely to saber-rattle in this way. This is due to game theory, because countries like the US and India in each situation are far more powerful by conventional military means, they have less of an incentive to threaten nuclear war. However, Russia and Pakistan are the two weaker sides respectively, and they have an incentive to not use nuclear weapons first, or rather to threaten the use of nuclear weapons first. In the weaker party's eyes, it's better to have your stronger opponent back down from a lose-lose situation with nukes than to engage in a win-lose situation with conventional weapons. Due to Pakistan's internal instability and prevalence of religious fundamentalist groups, many consider it to be the most dangerous carrier of nuclear weapons, given the fact that it could potentially fall in the hands of terrorist groups if the Pakistani state falls apart. Another nation which was developing nukes towards the end of the Cold War was apartheid South Africa. Due to its racist policies, it had become a pariah state on the world stage, and for a while, instead of dismantling their segregation policies, they doubled down, developing nuclear weapons to thwart any foreign pressure. These weapons were done away with when Nelson Mandela came into power and the apartheid government collapsed. Another power that wields nuclear weapons, most likely, is Israel. After winning various conflicts against its Arab neighbors, the country isolated itself, save for some reluctant treaties with Egypt, and it developed its own nuclear weapons. Israeli nukes have not been fully confirmed given the highly confidential nature of them, but there's quite a lot of evidence and reasoning to suggest that Israel has a fairly large nuclear weapons cache. However, today relations with the Arab states have by and large relaxed, even with the ongoing Gaza war in comparison to what they were during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and the biggest enemy of Israel today is Iran. Iran has saved up its own nuclear program for civilian purposes, which they claim is only used for civilian purposes. However, this has led to a great deal of resentment from Western powers, Israel, and Arab nations, which all fear Iran developing their own nukes. Keep in mind that Iran, at the point of this video, has enriched its uranium to nearly 60%, making it abundantly clear that these aren't just for civilian purposes. The Israelis have gone as far as to use computer viruses to mess with Iran's power plants, mend relations with various Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, and share technology with them. And while Israel and Saudi Arabia still have deep reservations over the Palestinian issue, both of them are ironclad in their opposition to Iran. Israel has also destroyed nuclear power plants in Syria that were built by the North Koreans under the previous Assad regime. Sometimes geopolitics can be quite funny, even in a video about nuclear weapons. Speaking of the North Koreans, they tested their own nukes in 2006 when the Bush administration was looking for weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that ended up not existing. While Saddam didn't have the ability to produce nukes at the time, the Kim family did. To prevent nuclear proliferation from spreading to North Korea's closest enemies, South Korea and Japan, the US has placed both nations under its own nuclear umbrella. As crazy as North Korea is, developing nukes is quite possibly the most rational move they've ever made, knowing that their stockpiles prevent them from becoming invaded. After all, when Gaddafi, the dictator of Libya, had given up on his nuclear weapons program, he eventually was toppled by rebels backed by Western forces. This wasn't the first time giving up on nukes made a country more vulnerable. One you may have heard of is Ukraine. When the Soviet Union collapsed, some of its nukes were located in Ukraine. Some Ukrainians want to keep the nukes, given that they had suffered immensely under the boot of Moscow. However, Russia wanted the nukes back, and Western powers pressured Ukraine into giving Russia the nukes in order to avoid nuclear proliferation, under the condition that Russia would respect Ukraine's territory and sovereignty, and we found out just how much respect they gave them. These factors, unfortunately, provide a set of circumstances in which countries are more likely to hold on to their nuclear weapons, especially if they're small. It can also provide countries with nukes an incentive to bully others, with limited backlash from the international community. Some view nukes as an ironic path to peace, and there's some element of truth to this, but it's also extremely risky. Nuclear weapons aren't always the best deterrent for war. During the 2000s, there was a brief war between India and Pakistan, and this was when both of them have nukes, and while the nukes weren't used, they didn't stop the outbreak of the war either. Keep in mind that any attempt to get rid of nuclear weapons would require diplomacy to be managed properly. This could be done through the use of cross-inspections, but it's very unlikely to be done at a time of heightened geopolitical tensions like we're in today. It's a shame that much of this wasn't done during the 1990s when the atmosphere was more relaxed. I can't tell you if we will dismantle all the nukes one day, or if we manage to destroy ourselves in the process. Yes, a major exchange would probably not lead to the extinction of our species, or even the end of civilization, but quite possibly the end of the civilizations of the Northern Hemisphere. There's a reason why so many billionaires are investing property in New Zealand. Maybe the cockroaches will take over. Let's hope they don't. Cockroach empires or not, the story goes back to Oppenheimer's quote from Hindu scripture. Men looked at nature and saw the gods of destruction. Man would rise up to harness the power of nature and become the gods of destruction themselves.